To understand the manor court, you first have to understand the manor. The manor was the basic unit of life for most people in the Middle Ages. It was a small world. Imagine a village surrounded by large, open fields. There was a church, a mill for grinding grain, and a large house where the Lord lived. Or, more often, where his representative lived, because the Lord might own dozens of manors and not live there himself. This world was built on a simple, rigid structure. At the top was the Lord. He owned the land. He didn't get it by buying it in the way we do now. He held it from a greater noble, or maybe even the king, in exchange for military service. Everything flowed from this. The Lord's power came directly from the land he controlled. Below the Lord were the peasants. They were the ones who did all the work. They were the vast majority of the population. These peasants were not all the same. Some were freemen. A freeman might own a small piece of land outright or rent it for cash. He had more rights and could, in theory, leave the manor if he wanted, but most peasants were not free. They were villains or serfs. A villain was tied to the land. He couldn't leave without the Lord's permission. He didn't own the land he worked. He held it from the Lord. In exchange for this land, a place to live, and the Lord's protection, the villain owed him things. These obligations were the core of the manorial system. A villain owed the Lord labor. This meant he had to spend a certain number of days each week working on the Lord's personal land, the demise. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, whatever needed doing, he also owed the Lord a portion of his own crops. And he had to pay fees to use the Lord's mill to grind his grain or his oven to bake his bread. He couldn't just build his own. Everything was tied back to the Lord. This system needed rules. It needed a way to manage all these relationships and obligations. What happens if a villain doesn't show up for his labor duty? What happens if one peasant's cow wanders into another's vegetable patch and eats everything? What happens when a man dies and his son wants to take over his land? These were not questions for the king's court in a faraway city. These were local problems. They required a local solution. That solution was the manor court. The manor court, sometimes called a hallmoot or a court baron, was the legal and administrative heart of the manor. It was the Lord's court, and its authority came from him. Its job was to regulate the life of the village and enforce the custom of the manor. This custom was a set of unwritten rules, traditions, and precedents that governed everyone. It decided how fields were plowed, when animals could graze on the common land, and who owed what to whom. The court usually met in the Lord's hall, the main room of the manor house. If there was no suitable house, it might meet in the church or even outside under a large tree. It was a public event. It wasn't some secret meeting behind closed doors. Everyone was expected to be there, or at least all the heads of household. Attendance was often mandatory. If you were a tenant on the manor, you were expected to show up. Not attending could get you a fine. The court wasn't just about punishment. It was the central nervous system of the community. It was where the business of the manor was done. It was where land was formally transferred from one person to another. It was where local officials were elected. It was where new bylaws were announced. And yes, it was where disputes were settled and petty crimes were punished. Think of it as a combination of a town hall meeting, a small claims court, and a local police station all rolled into one. It was deeply personal. The people making the decisions and the people being judged were neighbors. They saw each other every day in the fields, at the well, and in the church. This wasn't an abstract legal system with robed judges they had never met. It was justice delivered by the community, for the community, but always under the watchful eye of the Lord or his agent. The Lord's power was the ultimate source of the court's authority, but the community's participation gave it life and made it work. This was the place where the small, everyday dramas of medieval life played out. It was where order was maintained in a world that could otherwise be very messy. The manor court didn't meet every day. It usually met every 3 weeks or so, though this varied from place to place. The summons would go out, and on the appointed day, the tenants of the manor would gather. They would leave their plows and their work for a few hours to participate in the central ritual of village life. The person in charge was not usually the lord himself. Lords were busy men, often involved in politics or war. They owned many manors and couldn't be everywhere at once. The real power of the courtroom was the steward. The steward was a professional, an educated man who knew the law and the custom of the manor. He traveled from one of the lord's manors to another, holding court in each. He was the lord's legal representative, acting as the judge. His job was to run the proceedings, interpret the custom, and ensure the lord's interests were protected. That meant making sure fines were collected and fees were paid. Alongside the steward might be the bailiff. The bailiff was the lord's man on the ground, a permanent fixture on the manor. He was the enforcer, the manager who made sure the villeins did their work. In court, he might present offenders and report on things that had happened since the last session. But the most important group of people, after the steward, was the jury. This wasn't a jury like we have today, a panel of 12 strangers who know nothing about the case. The manor court jury was made up of the tenants themselves. They were called the homage, a group of respected men, both freemen and villains, who were sworn in at the start of the session. Their job was not just to decide guilt or innocence in a specific case. Their primary role was to know and speak the custom of the manor. They were the living memory of the community. When a tricky question of inheritance came up, the steward would turn to them and ask, "What is the custom here? What happened the last time a man died with 2 sons and no will?" They knew the families, the fields, and the histories. The court day would begin. A clerk, often traveling with the steward, would sit with parchment and quill ready to record everything. These records are called the court rolls, and they are an incredible window into the past for historians. The proceedings were usually in Latin in the early medieval period, the formal language of law and church, but the discussions among the villagers would have been in their everyday English. The business would start. The bailiff or the reeve, a sort of village foreman elected by the peasants, would report on recent events. They would present people for offenses. For example, the reeve might stand up and say that John Carpenter's pigs got loose and rooted up the Lord's meadow, or that Alice Green had taken too much wood from the Lord's forest. These were offenses against the Lord, and the court would deal with them. Then came the disputes between the villagers. Let's say Thomas wants to bring a case against his neighbor William. He doesn't hire a lawyer. He just stands up in court. He makes a formal complaint, his plea. He might say, "William owes me 2 shillings for a sheep I sold him," and he refuses to pay. He would need to bring proof. Sometimes he would have witnesses who would swear an oath to support his claim. This was called compurgation. If Thomas could get a certain number of neighbors to swear that they believed he was telling the truth, he would often win his case. The idea was that your reputation mattered. Your neighbors wouldn't risk their own souls by swearing a false oath for a liar. Well, William would then get his chance to respond. He might deny the debt. He might say the sheep was sick and died. He might produce his own witnesses. There was a lot of back and forth. The steward would guide the process, but the jury of homage would often be the ones to decide the facts. They knew both Thomas and William. They knew who had a reputation for being honest and who was a known troublemaker. After hearing the arguments, the jury would confer. They would discuss the matter, drawing on their knowledge of the custom and the people involved. They would then deliver their verdict to the steward. The steward would pronounce the judgment. If William was found to be in the wrong, he would be ordered to pay the debt. And, almost always, he would also be fined. This fine was called an amercement. It was a payment made to the lord for having broken the peace of the manor or for having wasted the court's time. This was a key point. The court was not just a public service, it was a source of income for the lord. Every offense, every dispute, every land transfer generated fees and fines that went into the lord's pocket. If Thomas brought a case against William and lost, Thomas himself would be immersed for making a false claim. And justice and profit were completely intertwined. Once the judgment was made, the clerk would carefully write it down on the court roll. William Fletcher is in mercy for a debt of 2 shillings to Thomas Smith. Amercement 3 pence. The day would continue like this, moving from one small case to the next. A fine for bad plowing. A dispute over the boundary between 2 strips of land. An argument between 2 women that ended in insults. By the end of the day, a long list of village dramas had been recorded, and the lord was a little bit richer. The court would adjourn until the next time, and the villagers would go back to their fields, the order of their world confirmed once again. The manor court dealt with the stuff of everyday life. Its business can be broken down into a few major categories. The most important of these, without a doubt, was land. For a medieval peasant, land was everything. It was their source of food, their livelihood, and their identity. It was what they hoped to pass on to their children. And the manor court was the only place where the holding of that land was made official. When a villain died, his heir, usually his eldest son, had to come to the next court session to claim the land. He couldn't just take it over. He had to formally request it from the lord. He would pay a fee known as a heriot, which was often the best beast the dead man owned. This was a heavy price, a stark reminder that they didn't own the land, the lord did. In a symbolic ceremony, the new tenant would swear an oath of fealty to the lord. The steward, acting for the lord, would then hand the new tenant a rod or a clod of earth, representing the land itself. This process was called admittance. The clerk would record the entire transaction in the court roll. This entry was the peasant's only proof of title. It was his deed. Similarly, if a peasant wanted to leave his land or transfer it to someone else, he had to do it through the court. And he would come before the steward and formally surrender his holding back to the lord. The new tenant would then be admitted, pay an entry fine, and the transaction would be recorded. The court was the registry office for all land held by villeins. This gave the lord immense control. He had to approve every single transfer. It also provided a clear public record that prevented countless disputes. Disputes still happened, of course. Two families might argue over the exact boundary of their strips in the large open fields. A man might accuse his neighbor of plowing over a part of his land. These cases would come to court. The jury of homage would be asked to walk the fields and determine the correct boundaries based on memory and custom. Their decision was final. After land, the second major area of business concerned agriculture and the rules of the manor. The open field system required a huge amount of cooperation. Everyone had to plow, plant, and harvest at roughly the same time. The court enforced this collective rhythm. You could be fined for harvesting your crops too early, before the official start of the harvest. You could be fined for not doing your share of work maintaining the common fences or ditches. Animals were a constant source of problems. People's livestock was supposed to be kept in certain areas at certain times. After the harvest, for instance, animals were often allowed to graze on the stubble of the open fields. But if your cow wandered into a field of growing wheat before the harvest, you were in trouble. The court rolls are filled with cases of stray animals. Agnes Hill is fined 2 pence because her geese were found in the Lord's corn. Robert Carter's pigs damaged Walter Wood's garden. These were small matters, but they were the things that caused friction between neighbors, and the court's job was to smooth it over, usually by levying a small fine. The court also enforced the Lord's economic monopolies. Every tenant had to bring their grain to the Lord's mill and pay the miller a portion of the flour. If you were caught grinding your own grain at home with a hand mill, you would be fined heavily in the manor court. The same went for baking bread in your own oven instead of the Lord's. These rules were not about community order, they were purely about generating income for the Lord. The court also functioned as a low-level criminal court. It could not handle serious crimes like murder, arson, or rape. Those were pleas of the crown and had to be heard in the king's courts. But the manor court dealt with all the minor offenses. Petty theft was common. Someone might be accused of stealing a chicken or a handful of firewood from the Lord's wood. Assaults were also frequent, but these were usually minor scuffles. The court rolls describe people hitting each other with sticks or fists. The penalty was a fine. One of the most common offenses was raising the hue and cry. If you were being attacked or robbed, you were supposed to shout for help. The whole village was then obligated to stop what they were doing and come running to catch the offender. If you raised the hue and cry for no good reason, you would be fined for wasting everyone's time. The court also spent a lot of time on what we might call public nuisance cases. Brewing and selling ale was a common way for women to earn extra money. But they were supposed to sell it at a price and quality set by the manor's whale taster. The court rolls are full of women being fined for brewing bad ale or for charging too much. People were fined for dumping waste in the village stream or for letting their houses fall into disrepair. Finally, the court was a place for settling small personal debts and broken agreements between villagers. A man might sue another for failing to deliver a bushel of barley as promised. The amounts were usually tiny, but for people living on the edge of subsistence, they were important. The court provided a forum to resolve these issues peacefully without resorting to violence. It was a mechanism for keeping the complex social and economic machine of the village running as smoothly as possible. The manor court was not an abstract institution, it was a human drama populated by a recurring cast of characters, each with their own role and motivations. Understanding these people helps bring the court to life. The central figure, though often absent, was the lord of the manor. His authority was the bedrock on which the court was built. The court was his court, the fines were his income, and the tenants were his people. While he rarely sat in judgment himself, his interests shaped every decision. The system was designed to uphold his rights, enforce his privileges, and maximize his profits. Every judgment, in some small way, reinforced his power over the lives of everyone in the village. The man who wielded the Lord's power on a day-to-day basis was the steward. The steward was a professional, often a man of some education who knew Latin and had a good grasp of the law. He might be a minor nobleman, a lawyer, or a cleric. He was an outsider, not a member of the village community. This was a strength and a weakness. It meant he could be impartial in disputes between villagers, as he wasn't related to anyone or caught up in local feuds. But it also meant he might not fully understand the local customs or the personal histories behind a dispute. His primary loyalty was to his employer, the Lord. His goal was to run an efficient court, keep the peace, and ensure the Lord's revenues were collected. He was the judge, the administrator, and the financial officer all in one. He needed to be skilled at reading people, managing disputes, and asserting authority without causing a rebellion. Next in the hierarchy was the bailiff. The bailiff was the lord's permanent representative on the manor. He was a salaried employee, a kind of farm manager and policeman. He supervised the work on the lord's demesne, made sure the villains performed their labor services, and collected rents and dues. In court, he acted as a prosecutor for offenses against the lord. He would be the one to report that someone had cut down a tree illegally or that a tenant's roof was leaking. The villagers often disliked the bailiff. He was the enforcer, the one who made them work, the constant reminder of their obligations to the lord. A more complex character was the reeve. The reeve was a peasant, a villain, just like his neighbors. But he was chosen by the villagers each year to serve as their foreman and representative. It was a difficult and often thankless job. The reeve was stuck in the middle. He was responsible to the lord and his steward for getting the work done. He had to organize the labor services, making sure everyone showed up and did their part. If the harvest was poor, the lord might blame him. But he was also one of the villagers. He had to live with these people. He couldn't be too harsh, or he would be hated by his own community. He had to be able to command respect and get his neighbors to cooperate. In court, the reeve played a key role. He often presented minor offenses committed by villagers and was a key source of information for the steward about the state of the manor. Then there were the jurors, the men of the homage. These were the more substantial peasants of the village, the ones with the most land and the best reputations. Being a juror was a duty and a position of some prestige. They were the keepers of the community's memory. Their knowledge of precedent and custom was the foundation of the court's decisions. They had a real, though limited, power. The steward might be the judge, but he relied on the jury to tell him the facts of a case and the custom of the manor. This gave the peasants a voice in the legal process. A jury could shield a neighbor from an unfair accusation or a harsh penalty. They could interpret the custom in a way that favored the tenants rather than the lord. Of course, they could also be biased, settling old scores, or favoring their friends and relatives. Their decisions were shaped by the dense web of relationships in a small, tight-knit community. Finally, there were the ordinary villagers, the plaintiffs, and defendants. For them, the court was a place of opportunity and risk. It was the only place they could go to seek justice if they were wronged. A man whose neighbor's ox had trampled his corn could get compensation. A woman who was slandered could have her good name restored. But going to court was also risky. You might lose your case and be fined for making a false claim. You were speaking in front of all your neighbors and the Lord's powerful representative. It took courage to stand up and make a complaint. For most peasants, their interactions with the court were likely about small fines for minor infractions, their animals straying, failing to clean a ditch, or arguing in public. For them, the court was a constant presence, a regulatory force that shaped their behavior and reminded them of their place in the world. It was a system that was both a tool for their own use and an instrument of their subjection. The manor court was the dominant legal institution for ordinary people in England for centuries. For a peasant in the year 1200, the King's Court in Westminster was a distant, alien thing. The manor court was where justice happened, it was accessible, understandable, and dealt with the problems that actually mattered in their lives. Its importance cannot be overstated. It was the glue that held the manorial system together. One of its most important functions was maintaining social order. In a small village where everyone knew everyone else, personal disputes could easily fester and turn violent. The court provided a formal, public, and peaceful way to resolve these tensions. It offered a substitute for private vengeance. Instead of hitting your neighbor with a shovel because his pigs ruined your garden, you could take him to court. The process of airing grievances in public and having the community, through the jury, pass judgment was a powerful tool for keeping the peace. The court also gave peasants a voice, however limited. Through the jury system, they participated directly in the administration of justice. The custom of the manor was not just the Lord's law, it was the community's law. The jurors were the ones who knew it and spoke it. This gave them a degree of agency. They could shape how rules were applied. This created a sense that the law, at least at this local level, belonged to them and not just to the powerful. It wasn't a democracy, but it wasn't pure tyranny either. There was a constant negotiation between the Lord's power and the tenants' customs. And the court created records. The court rolls are one of the greatest treasures for historians of the medieval period. Because the clerks wrote down everything, from land transfers to fines for stray chickens, these rolls give us an incredibly detailed picture of life in a medieval village. We can trace family histories, see how land was used, understand the local economy, and even get a sense of personal relationships and quarrels. Without the meticulous records of the manor courts, our understanding of the lives of ordinary people in the Middle Ages would be much, much poorer. But the world of the manor was not static. Over time, things began to change, and the manor court began to lose its importance. The single biggest blow was the Black Death in the mid-14th century. The plague killed a huge portion of the population, perhaps as much as half. This created a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, peasants were in a much stronger bargaining position. The lords were desperate for workers to till their fields. A villain who was unhappy on one manor could now run away to another, where the lord would be willing to offer him better terms, perhaps even his freedom and wages, just to have another pair of hands. The old system of labor service began to break down. Lords started renting out their demesnes land for cash instead of farming it with forced labor. As the economic bonds of the manor weakened, so did the power of the court that enforced them. At the same time, the king's justice was becoming more powerful and more accessible. The royal courts began to extend their reach into areas that had once been the sole province of the manor courts. People found they could sometimes get a better or more impartial hearing from a royal judge than from the Lord Steward. The idea of a single common law for all of England began to take hold, gradually eroding the authority of the thousands of tiny local jurisdictions. And economic changes also played a huge role. The slow shift from a subsistence economy to a market economy changed the nature of landholding. The enclosure movement, which took place over several centuries, saw the great open fields and common lands fenced off into private fields. This destroyed the cooperative farming system that the manor court had been designed to regulate. When the common land disappeared, so did the need for a court to manage it. The manor court did not vanish overnight. In many places, it continued to exist for centuries, but its role became smaller and more specialized. It might continue to register land transfers or deal with very minor local issues, but its days as the center of village life were over. Other institutions, like the parish and the justice of the peace, took over many of its functions. The legacy of the manor court is subtle but important. It established the principle of local justice, of disputes being settled within the community. The idea of a jury of one's peers, of neighbors, sitting in judgment on a neighbor, has deep roots in these local courts. The meticulous record keeping set a precedent for English legal administration. And most of all, the court records provide a direct, unfiltered connection to the lives of countless forgotten people. In their pleas, their fines, and their arguments, we can hear the voices of the medieval villagers themselves speaking to us across the centuries about the things that truly mattered: their land, their families, and their place in their own small world.